They found it at 2,500 meters below the Indian Ocean. No fanfare, no press conference, just a remotely operated vehicle descending through cold black water, and then, without warning, the wreck of HMAS Sydney came into frame. What the cameras recorded that day in 2008 left maritime experts silent. Not speechless from awe, silent from something harder to name, because what they saw at the bottom of that ocean was not just a sunken warship. It was evidence. Physical, undeniable, steel and fire evidence of what had happened on the night of November 19, 1941, and why, for 67 years, no one had been able to explain it cleanly. Here is where the story begins to open. Because the deeper you go into the wreck of HMAS Sydney, the bigger the questions become. HMAS Sydney was not supposed to lose. That is the first thing you need to understand about this story. She was a Royal Australian Navy light cruiser, 562 feet long, capable of breaking 32 knots, armed with 8 6-inch guns and a combat record that made her a symbol. She had already proven herself in the Mediterranean, where she had bested an Italian cruiser in direct engagement. She was escorted back to Australian waters as a warship with real battle experience. She was considered fast, powerful, and essentially untouchable in the waters she patrolled. 645 men sailed aboard her that November. Not one of them came home. That single fact has haunted Australian naval history for more than 8 decades. An entire warship, an entire crew, vanished in a single engagement in the Indian Ocean, leaving behind no survivors, no immediate explanation, and a 67-year silence that only ended when a shipwreck hunter named David Mearns pointed sonar equipment at the right patch of seabed and held his breath. But before we reach the wreck, we have to understand what happened the night Sydney died. And that means understanding the ship that killed her. A ship that was not what it appeared to be. The German auxiliary cruiser Cormoran was 538 feet long, purpose-built for deception. She was disguised as the Dutch merchant freighter Straat Malacca, flying false colors and broadcasting a false identity to any ship that crossed her path. Beneath that disguise, she carried 6 hidden cannons, torpedo tubes, and more than 300 naval mines. She was a predator wearing civilian clothing. A wolf in the purest sense of that word. When Sydney spotted Cormoran on the horizon that morning, she gave chase. Standard procedure. A suspicious merchant vessel operating in Australian coastal waters during wartime was exactly the kind of contact a patrol cruiser was supposed to investigate. Sydney closed the distance. Slowly. Professionally. Her crew preparing for a routine interrogation of a vessel that, on the surface, appeared entirely ordinary. Here is where overconfidence entered the equation. Captain Joseph Burnett brought Sydney to within approximately 1,000 yards of Cormoran before the confrontation escalated. 1,000 yards. In naval terms, that is point-blank range. At that distance, the tactical advantage of a superior cruiser collapses. Speed means nothing. Maneuver means nothing. You are close enough that even a merchant ship's hidden guns can tear through armor before the defending crew has time to respond. German Captain Theodor Detmers had been waiting for exactly this moment. Cormoran dropped her disguise and opened fire. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was an ambush executed with cold tactical precision. 87 shells, 5.9-inch armor-piercing, and high-explosive rounds struck Sydney in rapid succession. Torpedoes followed. The aircraft Sydney carried, her engines, her ammunition stores, all ignited. She became a floating torch. A ship of 645 men, on fire from stem to stern, slowly going dark in the Indian Ocean while the sun dropped below the horizon. Cormoran did not survive either. The engagement had damaged her beyond saving, and her crew scuttled her before she could sink on her own terms. Nearly 400 German survivors were eventually recovered from lifeboats and debris. Sydney left behind nothing. No survivors. No wreckage recovered in the immediate aftermath. No distress signal received. Just absence. And for 67 years, that absence became a wound in Australian naval history that no one had the technology or the coordinates to close. There were theories, dozens of them, some credible, some not. Was the crew somehow complicit in their own approach? Had something failed mechanically before the engagement? Had Sydney been caught in an ambush more elaborate than German survivors admitted? The only accounts that existed for nearly 7 decades came from German sailors who had survived by scuttling their own ship. Their version of events was the only version anyone had. That is not a small problem. It is a foundational one. When the losing side leaves no witnesses, the winning side's account becomes history by default. Not because it is necessarily complete, but because there is nothing to compare it against. Think about that for a moment. 67 years of historical debate built almost entirely on the testimony of the men who fired the guns. David Mearns changed that. Mearns is a deep-sea shipwreck hunter with a career built on finding things that should not be findable. Using sonar technology and a systematic approach that incorporated German survivor accounts, historical records, and coordinate triangulation, he located the wreck of HMAS Sydney in March 2008. He found Cormoran first, then Sydney, the two wrecks lying 12 nautical miles apart on the Indian Ocean floor, their separation consistent with the German accounts of where and how the ships had gone down. The discovery was already significant. But what happened when the RUV descended to Sydney's wreck was something else entirely. More than 80 shell holes were documented across the hull, not clustered neatly in one area, spread across the structure in a pattern that told a story the moment you understood what you were looking at. The bridge had been obliterated. The bow section had detached from the main hull and been found at a separate location, consistent with catastrophic structural failure under combined fire and flood pressure. The lifeboats were destroyed. Not worn down by time, not scattered by current, destroyed, in ways consistent with fire and explosive force. Meaning that even if men had survived the initial bombardment, their ability to escape had been systematically eliminated by the damage itself. The aircraft aboard Sydney had burned, the ammunition stores had cooked off. The fire that started during the engagement had spread through a ship that carried its own accelerant in every direction. RUV cameras moved through the wreckage and recorded what 80 years of seawater had preserved: twisted structural steel, collapsed decking, the silent geometry of a ship that had died violently and quickly, settling into the darkness 2.5 kilometers below the surface. The divers, or rather the teams operating the ROVs, did not stay long. The wreck was declared emotionally overwhelming. Accounts from those involved in the 2008 expedition described the footage as devastating, the scale of destruction difficult to process. When you have worked on shipwrecks long enough to think you've seen everything the deep ocean can show you, and then you see this: 80-plus shell holes, a detached bow, fire damage reaching into every compartment. The professional detachment you have trained yourself to maintain starts to fracture. Maritime experts who reviewed the RUV footage found themselves confronting not just historical data, but human loss, at a scale that was suddenly, terribly visible. 645 men. And now, in high-definition footage from a remotely operated vehicle, you could see exactly what those men had been inside of when the end came. If you have been following this story and the weight of it is beginning to land, pause here. This is not just naval history. This is forensic evidence of 645 lives ending in a matter of hours, in the dark, in fire, in a ship that was supposed to be untouchable. The wreck did not just answer questions. It created new ones, and that is where Option 5 begins to earn its keep, because each layer of evidence peels back to reveal something deeper underneath. The shell hole analysis told investigators more than just impact count. The pattern of entry and exit damage on Sydney's hull allowed forensic analysis of Cormoran's firing positions and angles. The damage was concentrated in ways consistent with the German account of the engagement, but also revealed the extraordinary efficiency of Detmer's ambush. At 1,000 yards, Sydney's superior armament and speed had been neutralized entirely. She had been denied the one advantage that should have made her invincible: distance. The bow detachment raised its own questions. A cruiser's bow does not simply separate from the hull under normal sinking conditions. The forces required to shear that structure implied catastrophic internal pressure, consistent with flooding, detonation, or both, that went beyond what a surface analysis of the engagement had previously suggested. The structural failure of Sydney's bow told investigators that the ship had not merely been sunk. She had been torn apart from the inside as she went down. And then there was Thomas Ninnis Clark. Of 645 men, only one was ever physically recovered. A body washed ashore at Christmas Island, an Australian territory in the Indian Ocean, at some point after the sinking. For decades it was unidentifiable. In 2021, NADA testing finally confirmed that the remains were those of Thomas Ninnis Clark, a sailor aboard HMAS Sydney. He had traveled through the ocean for years before reaching land. He was the only physical evidence that the men of Sydney had ever existed in that water. One man, one DNA match, 67 years of families who had nothing but absence, and a name carved onto memorials and official records that marked 645 deaths with 0 bodies recovered. The confirmation of Clark's identity in 2021 was not just a scientific result. It was the closing of something that had been open for 8 decades. For the families of Sydney's crew, the wreck itself, photographed, documented, declared a protected war grave under Australian law, had already provided a kind of closure that no amount of historical debate could. The ship was found. The evidence was real. The story was no longer built only on the accounts of men who had survived because they were on the other side. But here is what the wreck cannot fully answer, and this is the layer that stays with you. Sydney had every technical advantage. She outgunned Cormoran. She outran her. She had fought and won before, and yet at 1,000 yards, in a single violent exchange, 645 men were gone. No survivors. No time to send a distress call that reached anyone. No lifeboats that could be launched before the fire consumed them. The question of why Captain Burnett approached that closely is one that naval historians have debated for decades without resolution. Was it overconfidence? Was it a calculated risk that did not account for the full extent of Cormoran's hidden firepower? Was there a failure of intelligence about how heavily armed German auxiliary raiders could actually be? The wreck cannot answer that question. The shell holes tell you what happened to the ship after the fatal decision was made. They do not tell you what was in a man's mind when he ordered the approach. That ambiguity is permanent now. The wreck is protected. No artifacts will be recovered. What the ROV cameras recorded is what the historical record will preserve. The ship at the bottom of the Indian Ocean is a sealed container. It holds its dead and it holds its final moments, and it will not give up either. What it did give up, what the sonar found and the ROV documented, and the experts who reviewed the footage were forced to confront, was the physical truth of what close-range naval combat between a cruiser and a disguised raider actually looks like. Not in a history book, not in a diagram, in steel, in fire damage, in a detached bow 2.5 kilometers deep. The wrecks of Sydney and Cormoran now lie 12 nautical miles apart in the Indian Ocean, declared protected war graves under Australian law. Nothing will be moved. Nothing will be removed. They are the permanent record of a single November night when overconfidence met tactical genius at 1,000 yards, and 645 men paid the price for the distance between those two things. If that scale of loss, that forensic precision, that 67-year silence finally broken by sonar and cameras and DNA means something to you, and it should, then stay with this story. Comment below with what you think the wreck reveals that the history books missed. Because the deeper this evidence goes, the larger the question it opens. The sea held this secret for 67 years. The wreck tells you what happened. What it cannot tell you is whether we have fully understood what we found, or whether the evidence sitting 2,500 meters below the surface still holds a layer we have not yet learned how to read. That question is not going away. And neither is the wreck.